At the holiday potluck, my aunt mocked, "Why bother coming if you're just going to sit there like a stranger?" The table erupted in laughter. I stayed calm, then silently withdrew my contribution to the family emergency fund. When the roof leak hit their house, they had nowhere to turn. I, 32M, let my family learn what happens when you mock the one who was holding everything together. The mashed potatoes were passing to my left when my aunt decided to destroy what little piece I had left at the table. She looked right at me with that theatrical concern she'd perfected over decades of family gatherings and asked why I even bothered showing up if I was just going to sit there like a stranger. The question hung in the air for maybe half a second before the entire table erupted. My cousins laughed. My uncle slapped the table. Even my own mother cracked a smile before catching herself. I didn't react. I'd learned that skill over years of being the family's quiet one. The boring son who worked in finance and didn't have exciting stories about bar fights or dramatic breakups. I just kept eating my turkey, took a sip of water, and let them have their moment. What they didn't know was that I'd already made a decision. Not out of anger, exactly. More out of clarity. The thing about being invisible is that people forget you're watching. They forget you're listening. And they definitely forget what you've been doing behind the scenes. I'd been managing the family emergency fund for 6 years. It started small, just something my grandmother set up before she passed. She'd asked me specifically because I was good with money and because, in her words, I was the only one who wouldn't dip into it for a vacation or a new truck. The fund had grown from her initial $5,000 to nearly $40,000. Every month, I contributed $500 of my own money. My parents threw in $200 when they remembered. My uncle contributed $100 sporadically. The rest came from interest and some careful investing I'd done. The fund had saved my cousin when his appendix burst, and he had no insurance. It covered my aunt's car repairs after that accident on the interstate. It paid for my parents' furnace replacement 2 winters ago. Nobody ever thanked me directly. The money just appeared when they needed it, like magic, and life went on. But sitting there at that holiday table, potato passing me by while everyone enjoyed their laugh at my expense, something shifted. My aunt had been the worst about the fund. Every time she needed money, she'd call it a loan, promise to pay it back, then act offended if I ever mentioned repayment. The car repairs had cost $6,000. I'd seen her new designer purse collection growing on social media while she dodged my calls about even a partial payment. I finished dinner quietly, helped clear plates, made polite conversation with my younger cousin who was home from college and seemed to be the only person who treated me like I existed. Then I left early, citing work in the morning. Nobody tried very hard to make me stay. That night, I sat in my apartment and opened my laptop. I'd set up the emergency fund as a simple trust with myself as the primary trustee. My grandmother had structured it that way intentionally. I pulled up the documents and spent 3 hours reading through every clause, every provision, every escape route she'd built in. Then I started making calls. By Monday morning, I'd moved the entire fund into a separate account under my name alone. It was completely legal. The trust gave me full discretionary power, and the original terms stated that the trustee could dissolve the arrangement if the fund's purpose was no longer being served. I documented everything. Every disbursement I'd made, every contribution, every time someone had promised repayment and failed to follow through. I had it all in spreadsheets color-coded and cross-referenced. I didn't tell anyone. That was important. I just stopped being available. When my aunt called 3 days later asking about getting some money for Christmas shopping, I let it go to voicemail. When my mom texted asking if I could check the fund balance, I replied that I was busy with work. Weeks passed. The holidays faded. January brought cold weather and the kind of problems that winter always delivers. The roof leak started during the first major snowstorm. My aunt called me 12 times in one day. I was in a meeting, then at lunch, then at the gym. When I finally called back that evening, she was frantic. Water was pouring into their guest bedroom. The ceiling was sagging. They needed at least $8,000 for emergency repairs, maybe more. She'd already called roofers and none of them would start work without a deposit. She asked if I could do an emergency distribution from the fund. She needed it by the next morning. I let her finish talking. Let her explain how desperate the situation was. Let her tell me that my uncle's back problems had kept him from working full-time and they'd fallen behind on their home insurance payments and didn't have coverage for this. Then I told her very calmly that the emergency fund no longer existed in its previous form. The silence on the phone was profound. She asked me to repeat what I'd said. I explained that I'd dissolved the trust arrangement and moved the money to a personal account. I used simple language, made sure she understood that this was legal and final. She asked why. I reminded her of the holiday dinner. She didn't remember at first. I had to walk her through it. The comment about me sitting there like a stranger. The laughter. The way everyone had made it clear that I wasn't really part of the family, just someone who showed up and took up space. She started backtracking immediately. It was just a joke. Everyone knew I was sensitive. She hadn't meant anything by it. I let her talk herself in circles. Then I asked her about the $6,000 she owed from the car repairs. She went quiet again. I asked about the family contributions she'd promised for the last 2 years. More silence. I mentioned that I had records of everything, that I'd been tracking every promise and every failure, and that I was done being the family's invisible ATM. She started crying. She told me I was being cruel. Her house was being destroyed. Water was still leaking. This was an emergency. I agreed that it was an emergency. Then I suggested she call my cousins who'd laughed so hard at dinner, or my uncle who'd slapped the table, or my mother who'd smiled. Surely they could pull together $8,000 among them. She hung up on me. Within an hour, my phone was exploding. My mother called asking what was wrong with me. My uncle left a voicemail calling me selfish. My cousins sent texts ranging from confused to hostile. I didn't respond to any of them immediately. I went to bed early and slept better than I had in months. The next morning, I sent a group email to the entire family. I attached a spreadsheet showing every contribution to the fund over the past 6 years. My contributions were highlighted in green. They totaled nearly $36,000, including interest I'd earned through investing. Family contributions totaled less than $8,000. I broke down every disbursement, showed exactly who had received what, and noted which amounts had been promised as loans versus gifts. Then I included a second spreadsheet showing all the promises of repayment. My aunt's name appeared 7 times. My uncle 3 times. My cousin twice. Total promised repayments, $18,000. Total actual repayments, $0.00. I wrote a brief explanation. I'd been happy to help family in need. I'd been happy to manage the fund and make sure money was there for emergencies. But somewhere along the way, the fund had become an expectation rather than a gift. People had stopped being grateful and started being entitled. And that dinner had made it clear how little anyone valued the person making it all possible. I ended the email by saying that the remaining funds, after I reclaimed my personal contributions, would be held by me for my own emergencies. If they wanted to start a new family fund, they were welcome to do so. I'd be happy to provide advice on structure and investment. But I wouldn't be contributing, and I wouldn't be managing it. The responses were immediate and vicious. My aunt called me every name she could think of. My uncle accused me of abandoning family in their time of need. My mother tried the guilt route, talking about how disappointed my grandmother would be. My cousins split into camps, some defending me quietly in private messages, others joining the public outrage. I didn't engage. I'd said what I needed to say. The numbers spoke for themselves. Update 1. 3 weeks after the email, my aunt's roof situation had gotten worse. They'd tried to get a home equity loan, but their credit was worse than I'd realized. My uncle had apparently burned through several credit cards over the years. They'd asked my cousins for help. My older cousin had just bought a new boat. My younger cousin was still paying off student loans. Neither could spare more than a few $100s. They'd tried to patch the roof themselves. My uncle got up there on a ladder despite his back problems and made things worse. Now they were looking at $15,000 in repairs instead of 8. The water damage had spread to their main bedroom. They were sleeping in the living room. My mother called me crying. She asked if I was really going to let my aunt and uncle lose their house over a stupid joke. I reminded her that it wasn't about the joke. It was about 6 years of being taken for granted. She said family was supposed to help each other. I agreed. I asked her why she hadn't helped. She said she'd given what she could to the fund over the years. I pulled up my records while she was on the phone and read her contribution history. $2,400 over 6 years. $200 a month when she remembered, which was about once a quarter. She got quiet. Then she asked what I wanted from them. An apology? I told her I didn't want anything. I wanted to be left alone. I wanted to stop being the family's solution to problems they'd created through poor planning and bad decisions. I wanted to stop being invisible until money was needed. She said I'd changed. I agreed. Then I hung up. My younger cousin, The one who'd been decent to me at dinner reached out privately. She told me that the family was falling apart. People weren't talking to each other. My aunt and uncle were fighting constantly. My parents were stressed about their own finances because they'd been planning to ask the fund for help with some dental work. Everyone was angry at everyone else. She asked if I felt guilty. I told her honestly that I didn't. I felt lighter. I felt free. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about who was going to call next with a crisis. I wasn't tracking other people's promises. I wasn't being the responsible one while everyone else lived beyond their means. She said she understood. Then she asked if I'd at least consider helping with the roof. Just this once. Just to prove I wasn't completely heartless. I asked her if she'd been at that dinner. She said yes. I asked if she'd laughed. She admitted she had, a little. I asked why. She said because everyone else was laughing and it seemed harmless. I told her that was the problem. It seemed harmless because I was harmless. I was safe. I was the one person everyone could mock because I wouldn't fight back. I was the bank that never closed and never demanded payment. And everyone had gotten so comfortable with that arrangement that they'd forgotten I was a person who could choose to walk away. She apologized. It was the first real apology I'd gotten. I told her I appreciated it. But I wasn't changing my mind about the money. Update 2. By February, my aunt and uncle had found a way to patch the roof temporarily. They'd borrowed money from a predatory lender at an insane interest rate. My mother told me this in what I assumed was an attempt to make me feel guilty. Instead, I felt validated. They'd rather pay 20% interest to a stranger than apologize to me. The family split had become permanent. My aunt and uncle weren't speaking to my parents because my parents hadn't helped enough. My older cousin wasn't speaking to my younger cousin because of something about the boat and priorities. Everyone had opinions about what I should have done, but nobody had stepped up to actually help. I'd started going to therapy. Not because I felt bad about my decision, but because I wanted to understand why I'd let the situation go on so long. My therapist helped me see patterns I'd been blind to. I was the family's emotional support animal. I didn't cause drama. I didn't ask for attention. I just existed quietly and provided resources when needed. And like a support animal, nobody really saw me as having my own needs or feelings. She asked what I wanted from my family relationships going forward. I realized I didn't know. I'd spent so much energy managing the fund and being available that I'd never considered what I actually wanted. Did I want Sunday dinners where people talked to me about my life? Did I want relationships where my value wasn't tied to my bank account? Did I even like these people outside of obligation? The answer was complicated. I loved them in an abstract way. They were family, but I didn't actually enjoy spending time with most of them. My aunt was dramatic and entitled. My uncle was loud and dismissive. My cousins were fine in small doses, but we didn't have much in common. Even my parents, who I loved deeply, had a habit of treating me like a safety net rather than a son. My therapist suggested I might need to grieve the family I'd wanted rather than accepting the family I had. That hit harder than expected. I'd stopped going to family events entirely. When my mother's birthday came around in March, I sent flowers and a card but declined the dinner invitation. She called me hurt and confused. I explained that I needed space. She asked how much space. I told her I didn't know yet. She cried. I felt terrible but held firm. Then something unexpected happened. My younger cousin reached out again. She wanted to meet for coffee. No agenda. No family business. Just coffee. I was suspicious but agreed. We met at a place near my office. She looked tired. She told me that watching the family implode had made her reconsider a lot of things. She'd always thought family meant accepting people as they were, flaws and all. But she was starting to realize that acceptance without accountability was just enabling. Everyone had accepted my aunt's entitlement. Everyone had accepted my uncle's poor decisions. Everyone had accepted that I would always be there with money and help. She asked if I'd be willing to rebuild a relationship with her, separate from the family drama. No borrowed money. No emergency fund. Just two people who happened to be related trying to actually know each other. I was skeptical but intrigued. We started meeting monthly. She told me about her job search and her complicated relationship with her parents. I told her about my work and my therapy and my growing realization that I'd been living a half-life. She didn't try to fix things. She didn't push me to reconcile with the family. She just listened. It was the first real relationship I'd had with a family member in years. Update 3. By summer, my aunt and uncle had lost their house. Not because of the roof, though that hadn't helped. They'd been underwater on the mortgage for years. using credit to patch gaps in their budget, and the roof situation had been the final straw. They'd filed for bankruptcy and moved into a rental that my older cousin owned, paying reduced rent in exchange for property management. My mother told me this during one of our monthly phone calls. We'd settled into a routine where she updated me on family news, and I listened without commenting much. She didn't ask for money anymore. She'd learned that boundary quickly, but she still hoped I'd soften eventually. She told me my aunt had asked about me recently, wondered if I was doing okay. I found that darkly funny. After 6 months of radio silence and accusations, now she was concerned about my well-being. My mother said my aunt had been humbled by the bankruptcy, that losing the house had given her perspective. I asked if my aunt wanted to apologize. My mother hesitated. She said my aunt felt like she'd been punished enough, that losing her home should count for something. I told my mother that punishment wasn't the point. I hadn't taken the money away to teach anyone a lesson. I'd taken it away because I was done being used. My mother asked if I'd ever forgive them. I told her I already had. Forgiveness didn't require reconciliation. I could forgive them for taking advantage of my generosity and still choose not to put myself in that position again. She didn't like that answer, but she accepted it. My therapy was helping me understand something important. I'd been angry for years without realizing it. Angry at being overlooked. Angry at being reduced to a function rather than being seen as a person. Angry at myself for allowing it. The holiday dinner had just been the moment when all that suppressed anger found a focus. Taking the money back hadn't been revenge, exactly. It had been boundaries. It had been saying that my resources were mine to manage, and access to those resources required treating me with basic respect. The family had failed that test spectacularly. My younger cousin and I had gotten closer. She'd introduced me to her friend group, and I'd discovered I was actually pretty good at socializing when I wasn't weighed down by family obligation. I'd started dating someone I met through those friends. She knew nothing about my family drama, which was refreshing. She liked me for me, not for what I could provide. The emergency fund money was sitting in investments, growing steadily. I'd earmarked some of it for a house down payment, some for early retirement contributions, some for actual emergencies that might affect me rather than others. It felt good to plan for my own future rather than constantly preparing to rescue someone else. My father reached out in late August. This was unusual. He was typically content to let my mother handle family communications. He asked if we could meet for lunch. Just the two of us. I agreed cautiously. We met at a diner halfway between our homes. He looked older than I remembered. He ordered coffee and pie and spent 5 minutes making small talk before getting to the point. He told me he'd been proud of me for standing up for myself, that he'd watched me be the family's doormat for years and hadn't said anything because it was easier to let me handle things than to address the dysfunction. He said my grandmother would have been proud too. She'd set up the fund hoping it would teach the family about shared responsibility, but she'd known even then that most of them would take advantage. That's why she'd put me in charge. She'd trusted me to know when to pull the plug. I asked why he was telling me this now. He said because my mother was wearing him down about reconciliation, and he wanted me to know that at least one person understood why I'd done what I did. He wasn't asking me to come back to family dinners. He wasn't asking me to restore the fund. He just wanted me to know I hadn't been wrong. We finished lunch and went our separate ways. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was something. A small acknowledgement that I'd been seen, even if only by one person. As fall approached, I found myself thinking less about the family and more about what I wanted from life. I'd spent my 20s being responsible, my early 30s building that emergency fund and being available. Now, at 32, I was finally living for myself. It felt selfish in the best possible way. My younger cousin told me that my aunt had started therapy too, that she was working through some of her entitlement issues and trying to rebuild her finances the right way. I was glad to hear it, but it didn't change anything for me. Her growth was her responsibility, not my concern. The family had learned to function without me. They'd learned to pool resources when needed, to actually discuss finances before making big decisions, to live within their means mostly. They'd learned the hard way that safety nets don't appear magically. Someone has to build them and maintain them, and that someone deserves respect. I don't regret taking the money back. I don't regret the boundaries I set or the relationships I walked away from. That holiday dinner had been the catalyst I'd needed to finally value myself the way I'd been valuing everyone else's emergencies. And sitting there like a stranger, as my aunt had so helpfully pointed out, had been the last time I'd let anyone make me feel small. The roof leak that hit their house hadn't just exposed rotting wood and water damage. It had exposed 6 years of taking advantage of someone who'd been too polite to say no. And when they'd had nowhere to turn, they'd finally learned what the rest of us already knew. That you can't mock someone and expect them to save you. That family requires mutual respect, not just shared DNA. And that some bridges, once burned, are better left as ash.